I've been talking to Bord Bia, which is the Irish Food Board, about the future of the food industry, and this is a time of extraordinary change. Here we are in May 2008 with wheat prices that have soared way above any historic level, this is set to continue. Now, why has this happened? Well, it's a whole combination of different things which appear at first sight to be very good for farmers. It includes the Australian drought. It includes the fact that we have 1 billion people alive today who are children. They're growing up, their appetites are growing, but more important, the appetites of their parents are growing, their economic growth is growing. We're seeing an emergence of a middle class in places like India which can now afford to eat meat. You need 5 kilograms of grain at least to produce a kilogram of flesh of an animal. So as people start to convert from grain eating to meat eating, we're seeing pressures on the food system, and then there's biofuels, which we'll come back to in a moment. But one of the great problems is the fact that emotions are so important in the food industry, and they are right at the center of consumer thoughts about their food. And it might be whether food is for life or whether it's a poison. In other words, whether the additives and things like that are things that you can trust are eatable, or whether you should keep them away from your children. Food is something which causes obesity, which is now causing $100 billion of extra expenditure for the US government. We see an epidemic of obesity in America. 1 in 3 newborn babies will develop adult-style diabetes. That's because of obesity. Many of them might have been expected to have got diabetes of that kind at the age of 65. Instead, they're developing this before their 7th, 8th, 9th or 10th birthdays. This is a national disaster. We're seeing the issue of food for well-being, food for life enhancement, food for additional memory, food to protect your heart. We've seen controversies, as I've said, about the fusion of food and fuel markets in the biofuels debate. We've seen controversies over the use of countryside, even over whether farmers are able to generate revenues from wind, farmland use, European Union subsidies, food dumping of westernized, subsidized foods into developing countries, issues of animal welfare, pollution, pesticides, fungicides, slurry, runoff, goodness knows where it really finishes. But the fact of the matter is that whereas leaders are interested in communicating their values and their vision, the media is interested in revelation. And that means digging away for secrets which are inside the food industry that the food industry might not like to get out. And a media story can have catastrophic power. I will never forget when there was the dioxin scare in Belgium. We saw a certain amount of animal food, a relatively small amount, was contaminated by the use of fuel from, actually it was old oil, industrial oil, which was put into animal feed as a replacement for rapeseed oil and other things. It just was an easy way to dump 1 lorry load, and that 1 lorry load was full of a contaminant within that old oil, which is dioxin. Dioxin is produced in oil automatically by nature when you heat it to a very high temperature, and dioxin is highly poisonous. It remains in the food chain, and it got into the feed, therefore it got into chickens, it got into all kinds of things. But that was in Belgium. A chicken farmer at that time, 1 week after the scare broke, in Italy, told me with tears in his eyes how he had to slaughter 3 million small chickens because there was no market for them. Not a single chicken was being sold that weekend in Italy, and it was the same the following week. There was no evidence whatsoever that a single gram of contaminated feed had ever got into Italy, but the emotions within the consumer across the whole of the European Union were so powerful that it killed the whole market stone dead for a while. So, as I say, food is a very emotional business. And in this day and age of YouTube, Wikipedia and the rest, and TripAdvisor and so on, in the Web 2 world, people believe what other consumers say online far more than they believe a national health advisor or an official spokesman from the food industry, or indeed, with the greatest respect, the CEO or chairman of your own food company. So that's a big challenge for us in terms of winning trust of consumers, because it takes 25 years to build the brand, but only 25 hours to lose it. Now, the food industry is being powered in part by the urbanization of big populations like China, where 300 million people will move to cities by 2020. By the same year, we will see 748 million people in African cities against only 200 million today. So, as people urbanize, they move away from the land. They stop growing their own food as subsistence farmers, and they enter the food market, the global food market in the true sense. And the trouble is this: in those megacities, the majority of people are still living on less than $2, $3, or $4 a day, and up to 80% of the poorest people in those megacities are spending 80% of their 80% of their daily budget on food. And that is a big problem if food prices suddenly double or treble as they have done. And the result is inevitable, predictable, and it's happening, of course, and it's food riots, and you will continue to see those in groups of people who feel totally frustrated, who cannot feed their families, who just sold the very saucepans in which they used to cook their food in order to buy more flour, more mealie meal, or whatever it is, rice, that they use to feed their families. So this is a political nightmare. It's going to cause the instability, political instability. It will cause changes in governments. It will cause the fall of entire institutions. And it will cause new waves of political tension between nations, and indeed between tribes inside nations and other tribes inside nations. By that I mean any group of people, not an ethnic tribe necessarily. I mean an economic tribe, I mean a social tribe, I mean a political tribe, a geographic tribe, and we will see these kinds of things played out even more so long as politicians make the incredibly foolish error of combining food and fuel prices by linking them with biofuel. What a crazy thing to do, to make a mechanism by which farmers can sell their grain to put into the fuel tanks of private executive jets at the most extreme. Now, the fact is that the European Union have said that by beyond 2010, 5% of all all petrol has to be from biofuel. The United States is using 20% of next year's fuel crop in 2009 for biofuel, and the biofuel stampede has only just begun. And as it takes its force, you will continue to find speculation in just about every future foodstuff which can be converted in theory into fuel. So we're seeing stockpiling of sugar. Why? Because people think that sugar will be a great thing to sell to biofuel factories when there's suddenly a sugar famine. We're seeing stockpiles of just about every kind of foodstuff. In retaliation, we're seeing nation after nation lock their doors and say that their food cannot be exported. And that means that countries which traditionally import food are in further crisis. This chaos will continue for quite a while. In the meantime, as wheat prices have gone up, so people have converted their fields from growing soybean to growing wheat. That in turn has produced a shortage of soybean oil, which has produced a soybean cooking oil shortage. And that in turn means more people want to sow soybean fields, and they want to cut down trees to grow other things. So every food product in every acre of farmland, I don't care what it produces, is now in a very complex, interwoven way, meshed into the global energy market. And that is a big problem when energy suddenly jumps in the course of 6 years from $15 a barrel to over $135 a barrel, with some people saying it could spike as high as 200. Now, while it could drop to 70 or so, it's still a major question, because it also creates instability in the food markets, because the oil prices themselves are so linked to all kinds of issues, whether it's a terror attack on a Saudi, perhaps a Saudi refinery that's thwarted or not. It could be a disruption in the Niger Delta because of activist groups. It could be political shenanigans between Russia and the European Union on gas. All kinds of things can happen that can make the world much more fragile in terms of oil supply at a time when stocks are there, but they're not sufficient to drive the world for very long. So biofuels will remain a very controversial area, and in the middle of all of that you will see further tangles over the moral or immoral justification for further CAP subsidies, which in Ireland alone come to some $12.2 billion between the years 2007 and 2013.